Welcome again, everyone. My name is Brendan Rensing. I'm a professor of history here at BYU and associate director of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies, which is co-sponsoring this event. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We have with us the co-authors of this fine volume, The Life and Adventures of Eli Wiggill, South African 1820 settler, Wesleyan missionary, and Latter-day Saint. I'm going to introduce both of them, and then I'll leave it up to them as far as what we're speaking. Jay Buckley is director of the Redd Center, also director of the American Indian Studies minor here at BYU and associate professor of history. He earned his PhD from the University of Nebraska, and his first book, William Clark, Indian Diplomat, won multiple awards, and he's followed up with 12 more books, numerous articles, conference presentations, other publications, all the things that scholars do. Most recently, he co-authored a volume for the University of Nebraska Press, together with another professor, Jeff Notes, entitled Great Kings Courts. And he is currently wrapping up a book on the history of sheep. Fred E. Woods is professor of church history and doctrine here at BYU, where he has taught since 1998. He holds a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Utah and is published most widely on Latter-day Saints around the world, and more recently in specific states here in the United States. Most recently, he authored or co-authored a number of books and articles on Latter-day Saints in Tonga, Alaska, Hawaii, as well as a recent 2023 book with the University of Nevada Press entitled The Bright Lights of the Desert, the Latter-day Saints of Las Vegas. He's also the chief editor of the Saints by Sea database, and is slowly chipping away at a series of Saints by State. So join me in welcoming Professor Buckley. So that's as you look at if you are a relative of the immigration, we welcome to the great legacy of and we'll have time for questions for the really excited to share this. Right, with us, we're going to share three times the first, and then I think we another emphasis is in collaborating with partners. Certainly, South Africa, I guess among the companies mentioned
Native communities about missionary activities. And so we partnered together following this publication. We partnered together in publishing this primary schools, a scholarly edition of Eli Burma. Everyone will have access to this wonderful record. We also invited one of our students, or fellows, to participate in basically her duties and mentoring in this whole situation. And of course, he loves fishing, so what better theme to tell him about missionary work. To give you a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about and discussing, I'll briefly give you a little background on South Africa. Perhaps a video into South Africa. A small number, so I'll just give you a little background. Talk about how the Wiggill arrived there, the efforts of the Latter-day Saint missionaries in the 1850s, their immigration to Utah. South Africa's native peoples are a kaleidoscope of different places. Indigenous nations like this community are predominantly in the West. So all of these narratives. There's also Europeans that are seeking access to the ports in Asia. Portugal was among the leaders in transverse and go around what became known as the Buckley port. It was named as by King John VII of Portugal because, as he was mentioned, this was the pathway to the port. And so until the mid 17th century, the Dutch East Indies some of the sailors stranded at the Cape had planted crops and no kind of what. And so when they discovered that, they probably planted some company represents the in the 1650s, until the 17th, the British begin expanding to South Africa in the 1790s. There's a brief occupation of the Cape, and then some intermittent conflicts, and eventually they take over ownership in the early 1800s. The Cape Colony, as you see on the map here, is a fairly large territory. South Africa has over 1,700 miles of coastline. And so all along this coast are places where the British wanted to establish a settlement. Unfortunately, there are very few ports that you can navigate. One of those, of course, is Cape Town, which is a beautiful ones were East London and Port Elizabeth. And you can see Port Elizabeth there. And it's going to be in this part of South Africa that we'll be primarily discussing our early years with Eli and his family. Now, at the same time, when the British come, there's also these Dutch Reformed farmers or Boers who are already settled in the Western Cape, and they do not want to be under British jurisdiction. And so they leave on like a pioneer pilgrimage. It's called the Great Trek. So from the 1820s and 1830s, there's this massive migration inland, which brings them into contact with other Nguni and Xhosa and Zulu folks, and there will be a series of wars over the next century. Meanwhile, the British are interested in getting settlers to travel to South Africa and establish a base for them. And they actually had a competition where British colonists could submit almost to a land lottery and talk about what their skills were, what they brought to the table, how big their family was, why they would be good candidates. And of all these thousands and thousands of people who applied for land, 4,000 lucky ones were granted a one-way ticket to go settle in South Africa. When they arrived in Cape Town, this was on March 5th, 1820. Think of it, just 21 days before the first vision, they're arriving here in the Cape. After landing that spring, they continue on to Algoa Bay or Port Elizabeth, and you see the beautiful rendition of Table Mountain, the iconic figure of anyone who goes to South Africa. Landing in Algoa Bay was a bit of a change for all of these folks who had come from the British Isles. For one thing, there were only 30 people living in Port Elizabeth at the time, so there was just a few dozen huts. And they land and they're like, is this where we're going to settle? And they said, no, your land is inland 100 miles. So they're like, oh, man. So they get some wagons, some oxen, and just the few belongings that they brought with them. And they trek inland and establish a new place called New Gloucester. They were from Gloucestershire in England. And basically, they said they pulled their wagons up, they put their suitcases out, and they looked around, and they were in the center of Africa. And they said, okay, make a community. Of course, they built some fires that night so they wouldn't get eaten by the lions and hyenas. But over the course of the next few decades, they began to establish a presence. There were already indigenous people living in that area, but there had also been 50 years now of warfare with both the Dutch and the British against some of these native tribes. And so this land that the British government had granted to these colonists was kind of a borderlands. It was a buffer zone between the British Profaria, which is kind of an African homeland, and the Western and Eastern Cape provinces. The Wiggles were assigned to the Bradshaw Company, and they go to this Lemon Valley and establish their new home. They construct a series of windmills and other improvements. They have a series of setbacks, as you might expect, when the mill burns down and their crops are destroyed in fire, and just one continual setback after another. But eventually they build to stay, and this cottage in Bathurst is still standing. I think Fred took this picture while he was over there. Isaac became a well-known and prosperous settler over the many years. He was a skilled carpenter. He was a craftsman. He was a gifted wagon maker. And many of those skills he passed on to his eldest son, Eli, who's the topic of today's talk. Isaac also was baptized into the Methodist faith tradition by Reverend William Shaw. And this Methodism really took root in the Wiggill home. They loved the Bible. They appreciated the circuit riders, preachers who would come around episodically to convey the message of the good news. And eventually it's going to become such a presence in his life that Eli will go on a 5-year mission for the Methodist faith. But as a young teenager, he's entering into apprenticeships. And unfortunately, these apprenticeships were usually negative. But as we learned from President Worthen, we can also learn by experience as well as by study and by faith. And these happen to be negative experiences. But what they did is they transformed him into a young boy, into a man. And after those two experiences where his apprenticeships and internships didn't go as he planned, he returned to work with his father at the mill and in constructing wagons. I put a picture here of one of the kinds of wagons that they were building. These were large wagons similar to the four-trekker tradition. They were often pulled by 8 to 12 to sometimes 16 oxen, depending on the terrain. And you can see how detailed and how expertly made these wagons were. And Eli and his father became known throughout the region as the best wagon makers around. At the same time that all of this is happening, the church is being restored. The gospel of Jesus Christ is initiated in this last dispensation, in this first visitation of the Father and Son in 1820. Within a decade, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is established. And just 1 year after that, Eli and Susanna are married in Grahamstown, and they are beginning their young family. They'll eventually have 9 or 10 children together. They live in all kinds of different places: Grahamstown, Bathurst, Winterburg, Queenstown, Bongolo, Port Elizabeth, Bechuanaland, Tanachu. They're moving a lot as they're going about their business. The Bentleys were another one of the 1820 settlers that had received the land lottery to go settle in this Eastern Cape. And initially, Eli also gets involved in some trading experiences. He develops a pretty close relationship with many of the Khoikhoi and Amaklosa peoples that he's interacting with on a daily basis. And this is going to pay dividends down the road. His kindness, his forthrightness, and telling and keeping his word, they went a long ways. And we'll talk about a few experiences that he had with them. As you can see here then, from Port Elizabeth down in the bottom left corner of the screen, all of the way up to Winterburg, which is near the upper line there. So from here to here, he's living and residing in all of these communities from Grahamstown to Winterburg. And so it's pretty impressive because he's over the entire region over the course of his life. And at the same time, there's still difficulties with land ownership. The British had drawn a line at the Great Fish River and said that on the east side, the Amaklosa could reside without any pressure from settlers, and hoped that the settlers could experience the same benefit on the west side of the line. Of course, this didn't always work out as intended, and there were a continuation of these frontier wars that had begun in 1779 and lasted 100 years until the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879. Eli lives through about 3 of these. I think it's 6, 7, and 8. They numbered the wars because there were so many of them. There's like 10 or 11 total. And during the 7th or 8th war in the 1850s, they were taking refuge at Post Retief, and his son, Eli's son, John, was captured by the Amaklosa, and then when they asked him who his people were, he told them that his father was Eli, and he was released and sent back because they had that relationship with Eli. So that's pretty cool. But we have the great leaders like Makroma and Nangpa Wusi and the cattle killing events of the 1850s, and these were really traumatic experiences during this frontier time. At the same time, he's getting involved in missionary activity. He was asked to be an assistant minister for the Methodists and to help establish a mission in Bechuanaland at the Tanmashu Mission. And in the early 1840s. He's stationed there. And he takes his wife and his young children, and they go to this far away Umpakani Methodist mission. He learns Dutch and speaks Afrikaans very well. He also learns some Xhosa and some of the other native languages, and that too helped him in his both trading enterprises and his ministry. This is an image of some of the Wesleyan Methodists that met in Cape Town for a group photo. And now I'm going to turn the time over to my colleague, Fred Woods, and he's going to talk about the next phase of Eli's life.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and want to again thank the sponsors of this lecture today, the Charles Redd Center, the Education in Zion, which Heather's the director of, and Brendan's the co-director, and Jay the director, and also religious education. Any great project is always teamwork. And it's been a real pleasure to work with Jay. Jay is the epitome of a gentleman and a scholar. He connects with people. His students love him. He just won another mentoring award here at BYU. But a key point in all this, we both really believe in collaboration, and we believe in mentoring students. And the best thing about Brigham Young University is the students. We're glad they're here. And Wiggill family, we're so glad you're here. It's so sweet to have somebody lean over and say, "That's my great-great-grandma," with Susanna Bentley Wiggill. So we're just delighted to be with you. I think I want to just pause for a moment. I was thinking about this just off the cuff and just try to give us the big picture of the gathering. The prophet Joseph Smith said, "Don't let one single corner of the earth go without the preaching of the gospel." This is what was driving him. And so we know missionaries are sent to the British Isles in 1837. Heber C. Kimball, the first mission president, with 11 days of formal schooling. And Joseph said, "Don't preach the doctrine of the gathering until you have a firm foothold on the land." They'll have it by 1840. And so things have been going for a dozen years now. But keep in mind, this gathering coming out of Port Elizabeth is unusual because most of the voyages are coming out of Liverpool. Sometimes as many as 13 countries from Europe would gather. And the amazing thing is, we did not lose one single ship crossing the Atlantic in the 19th century, and just one in the Pacific. But in contrast, between 1847 and 1853, when the Brigham Young and that Vanguard Company came to the Valley, we lost 59 non-LDS immigrant voyages. So this was a very unique thing. Nobody could immigrate people like the Latter-day Saints, and people wanted to know why. The British House of Commons peppered Samuel Richards, the agent there, about the same time, for 4 to 5 hours, wondering, how do you do it? How do you do it? How do you do it? Charles Dickens called the saints when he examined them in 1863 on the ship Amazon, the pick and flower of England. So people could see the hygiene, the order, and it's just amazing to me. And people that are not Latter-day Saints, maritime folk, they're very interested in all this. And we love to tell them why we think that the safety record was so incredible. So in 1852, this is an interesting time to be a missionary. If you think you had a hard mission, can you imagine going into the mission field at the same time? So they're sending out all these missionaries, over 100 internationally. And it's at the same time that they have announced the saints have announced the practice of plural marriage. And so it was tough going. And so we would have newspapers started just come up all over the place. The Mormon in New York, John Taylor as the editor, the Western Standard with George Buchanan. We had even as far away as Sydney, Australia, Zion's Watchman, and the Zion's Luminary, or St. Louis Luminary in St. Louis, Missouri. But anyway, these newspapers are coming up, and as we'll see, there were tracts as well. But this was an interesting time to go without purser script. And when you were called on a mission, you heard it. You heard it over the pulpit from Brother Brigham, or one of the church leaders. So a very exciting time. And South Africa is unique in a number of ways. So we see this missionary activity. I loved Jay laying this out so well, giving us the context of what was happening at the time. You see the names of these early missionaries, and to read their journals, particularly William Walker's here, that's at BYU Special Collections. And we have Ryan Lee here, who has collected a number of these things, a specialist, 19th century archivist, and now they have him doing other things. But he's the one that brought in the Wiggill autobiography, these 4 volumes. I first knew about them in Rexburg, Idaho, when I was doing Saints by Sea in 1996. The family showed me those writings, and I was salivating, and so glad that Ryan pursued and was able to obtain them for the special collection so that Jay and I could examine them, and Hunter. So you get this dozen-year period where we're launching things. And we had, you can see in the Intelligent Public, where William Walker's writing about Latter-day Saints, often we were writing about defending plural marriage and gathering all over the place, wherever the missionaries were at. But this is the first tract they published in 1855. Missionary work is hard. Jesse Haven, one of the first elders to preach the gospel in South Africa, said, "It is not easy, as one who has had the experience might suppose, to establish the gospel in a country where it has not been before preached. When the climate weakens the constitution of persons brought up in a northern clime, where the people speak 3 or 4 different languages and are all kinds, grades, conditions, complexions, and where there are only 2 or 300,000 scattered over a country twice as large as England." So, and notice that this correspondence is going on in the Millennial Star. Launched in 1840, the idea was the Lord's coming soon. We gather into one place before the terrible trials come. And so it's the millennial day this is very important. There's been some great studies on this, Grant Underwood, particularly with his book. But the Millennial Star, this was the longest running Latter-day Saint periodical from 1840 to 1970. And then Ensign's introduced, now the Leohona. But very, very important to study global church history. Here we have missionary tracts by Jesse Haven again, and preaching the principles, the first principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ, teaching the restoration. And it's in 1857. This is the time in the context of the Utah War. And as you remember, the missionaries were being called back that had been sent out from Utah. Wiggill wrote, "It was about the year 1857 that I heard there was a strange people had come to Africa from America preaching a strange doctrine and making a great stir in Cape Town and baptizing a few. These strange reports went through all the papers from Cape Town to Grahamstown. And as I belonged to the Wesleyan denomination at that time and had been a member for at least 30 years, as I had said to a friend that they must have been sent of the devil to try to deceive the very elect, if it was possible. And I believe they were called Mormons, which I thought was a very strange name." So just one thing, Wesleyans, Methodists, Charles and John Wesley, our Latter-day Saint hymn book, you're going to see their name in there. And although they were not Latter-day Saints, I think it's a good moment just to mention that we have so many good people not of our faith that have gone out and preached the gospel of Jesus Christ. And for the global church history work, have provided translations in foreign tongues that the Latter-day Saints have built upon. So Eli's influenced by William Walker. He hears about Walker through his brother George. And he said, when I heard Walker explain things in the manner he did, I could not help but believe the truth of it. And and by the way, Eli he knew the Bible backwards and forwards. He said, my mind was so full of light knowledge of the scriptures, it seemed to me that I could see the meaning of every text in the Bible. Wiggill could not refrain from telling others about what he discovered. And yet, as a result, he wrote, I got the ill will of some of my own relations, most of all, my religious friends, and also my wife, who could not see it as I did. It made her feel very bad when she saw all our friends turn a cold shoulder on me. Anyway, he left his Latter-day Saint literature on the shelf for several weeks, yet continued to ponder what he had read. And then later, at last, he said, I pulled down my books again and began to investigate them the second time and found them more truth than I had ever seen before in them. So, of course, there's persecution. If the Latter-day Saints, going out doing the work, as Brigham Young said at one time, when a temple foundation's laid, the bells of hell begin to ring, and even the early beginnings of getting a temple. So the Talbots are important in this story. They become dear friends, intermarry with the Wiggills. And so in 58, as Jay said earlier, Eli is converted. And also his wife, Susanna, and two of their daughters, Sarah Ann and Margaret, March 1st of 1858. After hearing of Wiggill's baptism, some of his old Methodist friends thought he had been both deceived and deluded by the Mormons. Thus, Wiggill had a number of debates with them, but he noted, one of my old friends said that there was no use in talking or arguing with me, for it seemed to him that I knew the Bible from end to end from my heart. Just as a footnote, I would say at a time where the name of the prophet Joseph continues to be known throughout the world for good and evil as prophesied by Moroni, I would just say this. It's one thing to know the gospel's true. It's another thing to really know the gospel. And I love Peter's words that we should be ready to defend the gospel and to answer every question that is given to us. Eli's farm was flooded. A question I might ask here is, what does it take the Lord to move us to where he wants us to be? So his fame was, as a artisanship, a wheelwright. His life took a turn with his tremendous thunderstorm caused a river to flood his farm just outside Queenstown on the bungalow farm and carried his wheat away. Wiggill recalled it began to be well known to me that I could not stay here long, that I must pull up my stakes and begin to get ready for the place of the gathering, and that the flood had made such havoc. I began to think that it was time. So Eli and his family moved to Port Elizabeth, and we also have here, as you can see, Henry Talbot is serving there, and they're serving as church leaders. Wiggill wrote that after he got settled in, he took charge of the branch, which consisted of about 30 to 40 members, and held meeting in Mr. Talbot's house, Henry Talbot, twice on Sunday and once through the week, and by paying strict attention to our duty, visiting the sick, and also attending to daily labor. So this is just showing you a shot of Port Elizabeth. Jay learned on his mission that there was an area called Mormon Flats, and showing Latter-day Saint connections in the area. But here's another photo of the Wiggills and the Talbots. So now we get into a time of 1861. 1861 should send up a flag in our mind, and that this is the year in the spring, in April of 1861, that the Civil War, the American Civil War, took place. And it's interesting at this time period, during the years of the Civil War, the gathering, the number of people that gathered was at a peak. And as some of the general authorities said, it was the best sermon ever preached, because people were realizing the fulfillment of Joseph's prophecy about the Civil War, and that other wars would come and the end was on the horizon. So this was a very interesting time, not just that people that had been kind of a bit slack in the East think we've got to go now, but also internationally, and things would be published in the Millennial Star. And Brigham Young said the only safe place the saints would have a haven was in Utah. So there's a lot of people from all over that are coming. And so I think this is an important point to help us along the way. Another thing I would say is that the ship, or the bark, the racehorse, on the Saints by Sea website, that was a great collaboration with students, faculty, wonderful people that had helped at the Harold B. Lee Library that continues to sponsor and maintain this, is that we have all these voyages. The beauty of it is that even if your great-great-grandmother or grandfather didn't keep a journal, a first-person account, maybe a dozen other people did, that were on the same voyage, okay? So, I mean, we talk about, for example, the William Martin Handcart Company in 1856. So they're taking voyages on the Horizon and the Thornton. And there were, there's over 30 first-person accounts on the Horizon. You can kind of get a feel, the sail before the trail, of what's really happening. The other thing we learn as we study the larger picture, the context of all this, is that, like with the William Martin Handcart Company, we look at the land area as being the root of the problem. The root of the problem was, because of the Crimean War, we couldn't get ships out of Liverpool, and because we went so late in the year, that's why they're starting coming out of Iowa City. So there's all these connectors, implications that are important to understand. So you see, there's just 32 aboard here, and you have these early converts, and there's also this interesting African boy named Gobo Fango, and the Talbots had taken him into their home when he was about 5 or 6, according to Eli. And so by this time, he's, like 10. And this is just an image of what a sheep herder would have maybe looked like at that particular time period. So the racehorse arrives in Boston 1 week after the Civil War has been launched. So we have these wonderful accounts. While waiting at Chicago for a change of cars, Wiggill writes, and as the war had commenced about slavery, Mr. Talbot having a little Kaffir boy, some colored men happened to spy the little fellow in the car, determined to take him away. They accusing us of taking him into slavery, and caused great disturbance that they did not get him. For a lady of the LDS company had him under her crinoline, or we'll see it's crinoline, and they searched through the cars but could not find him, so that after that, he was kept concealed as much as possible and put girls' clothes on him. So this is an interesting time for a number of reasons. Now, let me tell you something. Many of you have studied the Civil War by land. Most people don't ever make it to the sea, but this was a time of high adventure. And we had the ship Alabama, that the Confederate ship that sunk 65 Yankee vessels. And during this time period, the same time period that the racehorse is crossing the Atlantic, you might have one of these Southern boys with a stogie that might come right up to one of our ships and say, "You better say your prayers, moments, because you're going down. You're going down." And then once they actually got into Boston, Philadelphia, New York, you see, because there's so much. You see the Mississippi River here, there was so much yellow fever and cholera by 1854 that they started bringing them in 55 because Brigham said, we're losing too many people on this river disease. So they'd come out to the East Coast, and Brigham said either Boston, Philadelphia, or New York. Most actually went through 65,000 of the 90,000 went through New York, through Castle Garden. That was the pre-Ellis Island. Ellis Island was built because Castle Garden was burned down in 1889. But suffice it to say, they get on this journey, and it's really interesting because it's at the time of it's at the time of the Civil War, and so these immigrants that are coming from afar, we know from journals they're actually fearing the soldiers more than the Native Americans. And they're wondering, when are they coming? When they get out to Missouri, you're probably wondering, with the extermination order by Boggs in 38, then we have that post period, not rescinded until 1976. But from Hannibal to St. Joe is 207 miles, right? And so you read accounts that they're trying to steal our beautiful Latter-day Saint women. They're shooting cannonballs over the heads. The guerrilla warfare is going on with the Confederacy. In St. Joe, we know they're trying to pin buttons on or badges on people to send them into the military. They'd get $1 a head. When they get out to Fort Bridger, they make them swear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. So this time period that Wiggill is going and other saints from South Africa really is high adventure. And his account and his writings, it's absolutely riveting. And Jay and I, we waived all our rights to the royalties as well as Hunter. We just wanted to get it out there. So I don't feel bashful saying, get the book, read it, and you'll find that eating and sleeping will become a burden for you because you will be thrilled of every page, almost every page. Anyway, Wiggill and the Talbot children intermarry at Florence. This is another interesting time. Do you know they actually moved the frontier outfitting post to Florence, the Omaha area here, 45 miles south to Wyoming, because in the words of Amos Milton Musser, the apostates were thicker than the lice of Egypt in the days of Pharaoh. So this is an interesting time that we're dealing with. And they're going to go on the Homer Duncan Company, right? So this is what, if you're really into this stuff, there's nothing uninteresting, only uninterested people. My wife once told me at 19 years old, and I thought, wow, she's cute and smart. And I had to capitalize on knowing more about her. But anyway, what you want to do, you want to go to by Saints by Sea to find out what's cooking with your own families. That will give you, the ocean crossings. Then you want to go out to the church biographical database, and they will give you these companies. And these companies are really quite interesting of what takes place along the way. And you can see Talbot becomes a chaplain, 264 individuals, 47 wagons. And by the time they get into Salt Lake, you see here, it's September 13th. And so it's just one thing I would say, that once they actually get into Salt Lake, we know from Eli's writings that Charles Roper from South Africa invited the Wiggles to stay with him until they had a place. So you have this wonderful support system. A great word for the Wiggle story would be transplanted, right? From England to South Africa, coming into Utah. And then after that, I love this, that William Walker was the one that helped the Wiggles find a small home in Salt Lake City. But they didn't stay there long. After they came with the Duncan Company and they came into the valley, pretty soon they migrated up to Kaysville, where, as Jay said earlier, they remained for 3 years, continued to Salt Lake, where Eli was doing his wheelwright trade. And then Wiggle's son-in-law, William Lowe, decided he wanted to go to South Africa, and his wife, Frances Amelia, as well as with her baby, came along. And what comes out of this is that they're there for several years, and Eli actually ends up serving a mission. And when you get into the nitty gritty of this, there were a few baptisms, but he will mention that he went on a mission to see his friends. He's, the years are going on, and he's, like we all do, softening. And so, but he did go as a missionary for 3.5 years. His autobiography comes to a close. So as you see here, he's writing, this is as far as the history of his life was written by my grandfather, Eli Wiggill, in the year 1883. His granddaughter writes. And so we have this 76-page autobiography. And then the last part of this is going to be the last decade will be taken care of by his granddaughter. So, yeah. Anyway, or I should say 74 to 84. This final decade is an interesting time where he will remarry, and he passes away in 1884, and thus ended the life and adventures of Eli Wiggill. And Brother Henry Talbot would be the one that actually spoke at his funeral. They remained dear friends. And Gobo Fango, he lived to be 30 years old. He was involved in the sheep cattle range war in Idaho, and he was shot and killed. And in his will, when he died, he gave his money, some of it to the Talbots, some to the Grantsville Relief Society, and the rest of it to the building of the Salt Lake Temple, which to me is very touching. So I'll just conclude with saying that it was a great blessing to work with my colleague, Professor Buckley, Hunter Hallows, and to be able to go through this wonderful account, this inspiring account of a Latter-day Saint that was transplanted to Zion.